Synesthesia is a free web app for painting sounds on a virtual canvas. It's in an ongoing phase of development, directly linked to the work of Xenakis and guided also by Daphne Oram's work with the Oramics Machine. It builds on these composers' thinking on composing outside of conventional musical bounds and places the idea of a low barrier to entry at its heart. In particular, our recent efforts have aimed to make the app accessible to young children. Addressing the conference theme of Have You Tried This?, the adventurous nature and educational aspirations of these composers are as relevant today as they were in their lifetimes. Paradoxically, the abundance of friendly musical tools, especially for young people, often constrain early opportunities for expression to quantized and safe outcomes. There are lots of scenarios where this is a great way to make music together and agree on a sound that works, but part of what we're doing with Synesthesia is trying to address some of what gets lost in that process. Mankind has a long history of coupling image and sound. As Berrio writes, the impulse to seek a union between image and sound comes to us from very far back and is rooted in an ancient synesthetic vision of the world. There are also reams of notable synesthetic musicians and artists. We can look to painters like Kandinsky or composers like Scriabin for prominent examples of people for whom sound and image were inseparable. These ideas manifest at least as early as the 1920s through technology, where we start to see early sound-on-film systems emerging globally. The 5-year plan from Shorin's Central Laboratory of Wire Communication in Leningrad is a good example of early explorations with such a system, where shapes of ancient Greek and Egyptian ornaments were used as a basis for shaping and synthesizing sound. If we follow the developments of these ideas forward to the 1950s, the ANS synthesizer takes its name and inspiration from Russian composer Scriabin, mentioned earlier, whose mystical theories of a unified art of sound and light had a huge effect on avant-garde composers and theoreticians in the early Soviet era. Murtson's objective with the ANS was to build an instrument that combined graphics, light, and music that gave a composer an unlimited palette of sound and freed them from the restrictions of instrumentation and musicians, a direct composition to music tool. By the late 60s, the idea of drawn sound expands to analog video systems, with instruments like Fernando von Reichenbach's Catalina Convertidor Gráfico Analógico, graphic analog converter, in 1967. But Synesthesia is most directly connected with composer Iannix Xenakis UPIC platform, having originally been designed as a homage to the system. UPIC was among the first digital to analog graphic scoring systems, using a large tablet-like interface through which a user could draw waveforms and trajectories for synthesized sounds. On this system, Xenakis said, "It was the inadequacy of traditional musical notation that pushed me in this direction, but the pedagogical destination was also very important. A child can draw a fish or a house, listen to what she did, change it and, through drawing, learn gradually to think about musical composition without being tormented by music theory or needing to know how to play a musical instrument." At various stages of UPIC's development, Xenakis was engaging with young people and non-expert composers with this system, enabling people to shape and form sounds without needing expert training. At this time, Xenakis' views on the way that music could be shaped, and especially the way that non-expert composers could be brought into the musical world through a system like UPIC, set him as somewhat of an outsider among his contemporaries in France at the time. Regardless, development on UPIC continued through to the early 90s, where it evolved through various iterations of hardware to a software-only PC version. All of this development carried forward 3 key principles. 1. Autonomy. From the creation of the score to the performance, there is no need for software engineers, musical assistants, performers, conductors, orchestras. Just the composer, their ideas, and the sounds these give rise to. 2. Freedom. UPIC doesn't force the user to think about music in a certain way, for example, in terms of semitones on the chromatic scale, rhythmic grids, or loops. 3. Education. UPIC is a tool to put music creation within reach of everyone. If you can draw or simply make signs with a pen, you can use it to create music. There are a number of successors to the UPIC system, and these principles can be seen to varying degrees in all of them. Perhaps the most prominent example is Iannix, a highly complex graphical plotting software that can play back data trajectories and is used by many professionals, not just in music but across the audiovisual arts in general. Hi-C was a cross-platform drawing and synthesis tool, again taking direct inspiration from UPICs. It's very fully featured, but has a complex interface. A more recent and similar example is UPiSketch, also a cross-platform drawing and synthesis tool with full features but a difficult-to-learn user interface. And it's the drawbacks of these steep learning curves and complex interfaces that puts the third of these principles in jeopardy, that of education and accessibility. But in 2016, French developers Buzzing Light put together their Iannix-inspired web app, Synesthésie. It was designed for installation use in a festival and a much more direct homage to the design language of UPICs, being much more accessible to anyone who can draw on a tablet-like interface. Because of its rapid development, Synesthésie is limited in its range of sounds, but succeeds where other UPIC successors fall short, being extremely user-friendly. This was the codebase that we inherited for Synesthesia. One key force in the reworking of Synesthesie into what is now Synesthesia was the work of Daphne Oram, another radical outsider composer whose thinking and works have a lot of crossover with Iannis Xenakis. Oram was known for being a highly adventurous musical thinker. She's famous for wanting to find the notes between the piano keys on her family piano as a child. After leaving the BBC radiophonic workshop she co-founded after just 1 year, Oram set up her own studio, where she began work on her own image-to-sound device, the Oramics Machine. Oramics was an analog synthesizer and scanning device designed to allow a composer to draw sounds onto 35mm film, which was then interpreted by the synthesizer. The interaction with Oramics is perhaps more expressive and painterly in the way that it captures gestures when compared with the UPIC system. We were keen to bring this expressivity into Synesthesia as a way to ensure that individual lines could become more flowing and dynamic, where they may have been more static in their sound beforehand. This means that individual drawn lines would take on a more temporally expressive and detailed quality than they had done before with Synesthesie. Taking cues from Daphne Oram's Oramics Machine then, we redesigned the synth engine for Synesthesia with a much wider range of sounds, and sounds that would take on the quality of how they were painted and not just where they were laid out on the page. We also added more variety in the look and colours of the brushes that represent the different sounds in the app. Continuing a theme of accessibility, we've been slowly adding different languages to the app, not just with the hope of allowing users to interact with the app in their native language, but also with the hope of exploring how the app might be used in multilingual settings, or especially in settings where English isn't the dominant language. Through Synesthesia's inheritance from Xenakis and the influences taken from Oram, we feel like one of the aspects that Synesthesia stands apart from many accessible music-making tools is in the ambiguous way that time is expressed through visual representations. Looking at a graphic score within the app, it's not always obvious how or when the various traces in a piece will play out. In describing Oramics, Oram writes, "So the composer has a reusable painter's canvas, but also this canvas has an added dimension, time. It has a duration, for it gradually unfolds itself to the listener, unlike the painter's canvas which is viewed all at once." This is similar to the differences in auditory and visual perception that Casey O'Callaghan points out when discussing the idea of sounds as multimodal sensory events that also incorporate memory and knowledge of the way that objects work in the world. Synesthesia, through its temporal ambiguity, has the ability to play on our expectations for how a visual gesture ought to translate through to a sonic event. We've been trying to explore how and where synesthesia can be used, trying to continue in the spirit of Xenakis' UPIC system with its focus on accessibility, education, and thinking outside of people's typical expectations for how music can operate. We're also thinking about synesthesia with an Oram-esque view on how technology can mediate our understanding of the world, particularly in light of the burgeoning developments in generative machine learning. In this current landscape, we especially value the imperfect nature of our drawings with an app like Synesthesia, and the limited but hopefully expressive interpretation of its synth engine linked to these scores. When many accessible or educational musical tools make wrong notes impossible, and text-to-music generators are becoming more powerful and impressive, we are interested to see how these raw, imperfect human gestures can become meaningful and exciting, and how this kind of activity can help us find links with each other and the world around us. So far, synesthesia has been used in a variety of settings, including school workshops, workshops open to the public, contemporary classical performances, and more recently, longer-term workshops in collaboration with a primary school that also incorporate field recording. In 2022, Synesthesia was used in workshops led by Birmingham Contemporary Music Ensemble, through which young people produced graphic scores that were handed off to composers commissioned to compose responses to those original works in Synesthesia. These were then brought together and performed side by side by Birmingham Contemporary Music Ensemble, in a concert that celebrated Xenakis' life and music 100 years after his birth. In 2023, the app was used as an interactive foyer piece alongside contemporary classical performances by Das Neue Music Ensemble in Hanover, where audience members of a wide age range were able to interact with and enjoy the app. More recently, and just this week leading up to the conference, we finished workshops in partnership with Gwaelod y Garth Primary School in South Wales. We've been working on how the app can find its place in bilingual or even minority language-led educational settings. This workshop ran in 3 phases. One where pupils went out to the local woodland to find and produce their own field recordings. A second session where graphic scoring and the Synesthesia app was introduced. And a final session where we collaborated on producing a special Gwaelod y Garth version of Synesthesia, in which all of Synesthesia's original sounds had been replaced by field recordings made by the class. As an early exploration of future directions from Synesthesia, these workshops have been really encouraging, as it's the between the piano keys potential of Synesthesia that a lot of the students found most exciting. What was especially exciting was that the majority of the class wanted to go out and record and compose more, and also that many felt they had started listening differently when out and about in our surrounding wild spaces. We're hoping to wrap this project up later in the summer with a concert that takes people's compositions back to the woods where they can be played back into the natural environment from which the source sounds were collected. The development of the app, then, is starting to move away from this original idea of synesthesia and expanding to incorporate a more holistic view on the role that this kind of audiovisual creation can play in people's lives. In the case of our most recent workshops, we tried to create a form of spiral learning that incorporates other things, learning about sound, speech, minority languages, science, local wildlife, the potential for local action, and about climate change, with music and visuals as a gateway into these subjects. We're keen to explore how synesthesia can become a better practical tool that helps people to engage with the world around them, with a particular focus on language, community, and our surrounding wildlife. Through all these changes, though, we continue to hold on to the 3 themes we found earlier in Xenakis' work. Autonomy, the freedom to use a free web app like this, either in groups or at home, without the need for specialist training, equipment, or instructors. Freedom to express other types of musical ideas outside of the conventional bounds for music making that are the focus of many musical platforms targeting young people, and assumptions that may be narrowed further by the training and output of large machine learning models. Education, where we're actively seeking out opportunities to share this way of making music and engage people through this type of creative production in more than just sound and visuals. Synesthesia continues to evolve as a free web app for painting with sound, and while it may change name in the near future, you will always be able to find it through the web address synesthesia.integra.io. Thank you.